when people say the universe looks old, it looks like it's an old universe. I'm tempted to ask, how do you know what an old universe looks like? You've never seen one.
That was Young Earth Creationist and PhD astrophysicist Dr. Jason Lisle, laying the groundworks for his Christian apologetics, where he tries to explain how it is that the observations of our universe in cosmology and astrophysics could actually point to a 6,000-year-old biblical Earth, rather than the consensus view among all the scientists in the field that it's actually 13.7 billion years old and corroborated by multiple intersecting lines of evidence from the CMB to distant starlight to supernovae observations. So how does Lisle explain any of this?
How do you know what an old Earth looks like? You've never seen one. We see the universe as it is. We don't see age. We see things that some people associate with age, but it doesn't look old or young. It just looks the way that it looks.
That's right. Lisle is a presuppositionalist, which means that he presupposes that his God specifically is necessary for us to even have knowledge of the universe in the first place.
Only biblical presuppositions would make things like knowledge, science possible.
You see, if you just start by assuming at the beginning that you're already correct, then you can never be wrong. It's brilliant. Dr. Lisle has just one little problem with his young Earth model, and that's the distant starlight problem, where we know that light travels at a finite speed, c in a vacuum, the speed of light. This means that the light that we're seeing from stars is actually from the past. The light we see from the sun is the sun 8 minutes ago. The light we see from distant stars had to travel a lot longer than 8 minutes. In fact, a lot longer than 6,000 years, which is how old Lisle says that the entire universe is. So you can tell why this is a massive problem for his model. In fact, the most distant light that we can observe, the cosmic microwave background, has been traveling for 13.7 billion years to reach our eyes and instruments today. This immediately debunks Lisle and his young Earth creationism. So he has to make up some sort of rationalization to explain this away. In fact, the very farthest galaxies that we can see themselves are a huge issue for Dr. Lisle, especially the ones that we've been seeing with the James Webb Space Telescope. And he's going to, well, let's just say, make some dishonest predictions and then act like his biblical model was vindicated because of them. We will get into what he characterizes as the James Webb results. It's very shocking for an astrophysicist, I'll say the least. But recently, Dr. Lisle made a guest appearance at Standing for Truth. There he gave an interview about his solution to the distant starlight problem, as well as his so-called predictions for the James Webb farthest galaxy observations. And actually, Donnie showed him a PowerPoint slide that yours truly made for one of my openings in a debate that I had on that channel, and basically just asked Lisle if he could please help him refute me. Please, Dr. Lisle, please help me refute Grayson. It's pretty funny.
I'm curious as to your thoughts on those who are claiming that the data actually supports or was expected based on the naturalistic model. And there's several points here in terms of the farthest galaxies. And I'm curious if you're familiar with these points here, and what would be a good response.
We will get to Dr. Lisle's supposed debunking of my points on that slide, as well as his very sketchy predictions and claimed victory lap about those predictions for the James Webb data. But first, we have to start with his model for the distant starlight problem of creationism, because that's sort of his whole thing. That's sort of what he's most known for within the creationist community. And it's one of the reasons why he goes on these shows and does these interviews, to try to push this idea that light can actually travel infinitely fast, instantaneously.
Dr. Lisle, what do you believe is the best solution to the so-called distant starlight problem?
Yeah, I think it's what I've called the the ASC model, anisotropic synchrony convention model. In the anisotropic synchrony convention, only light that is moving directly toward you is instantaneous. There is an equation. I've written down the equation. It's c over 1 minus the cosine of theta, where theta is the direction away from directly toward you. And that tells you what the speed of light is in different directions. Remember, it's half c when it's moving away from you. It's c when it's perpendicular, and it's infinity when it's toward you.
Now, Lisle is taking advantage of something in Einstein's relativity called the synchrony convention, which basically is the difficulty of synchronizing clocks because of the non-existence of any sort of simultaneous moment or now in relativity, and the fact that we always measure the two-way speed of light, never the one-way speed of light, which is like a known thing in physics. But it's a different thing entirely to say, well, hey, I know that we only measure the speed of light going there and back, but what if going there, it travels at half of the speed of light, and then traveling back to us, it travels infinitely so that it only looks like it averages out to the speed of light. Like, you see how just so and ad hoc that all feels? Yeah, you're not the only one, but, for the creationist, the Young Earth Creationist, that has these big issues hanging over their head that, they have to live in cognitive dissonance with constantly, like the distant starlight problem. This is Lisle comes along, he's a credentialed PhD astrophysicist, and he's spinning this yarn about how, hey, actually, within the mathematics of relativity, you can get away with this, even though, in reality, most of us, including the experts, would think that it's silly and ridiculous, and there's absolutely no reason or mechanism why light should change its speed at all, depending on if you're looking towards it or not. But to the creationist ears, this is an astrophysicist telling them that there's a way. There's a certain degree of validation when this is coming from an astrophysicist, which, by the way, we should definitely talk about that, because Lisle got his PhD in astrophysics doing like actual science, analyzing basically like the dynamics on the surface of the sun. Like, very cool work. But then as soon as he graduated and got his credentials, he went almost immediately into using his degree to do Christian apologetics for creationist institutions. So, yeah, it doesn't seem great. It kind of feels like he knew exactly what his career path was from the start and just sort of like, infiltrated academia just so that he could get the PhD so that he could go on and tell these other creationists exactly what they want to hear. And it sounds like it's, coming from an authoritative source, because he got his PhD in like the surface of the sun, which has nothing at all to do with the age of the universe at all. Like, nothing to do with distant galaxies or JWST or the anisotropic synchrony convention. But okay, he's going to use those credentials to try to lead these other creationists into thinking that, hey, Einstein's equations support the Bible.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, basically we're seeing the universe, everything in the universe, even the most distant stars and galaxies, in real time using this visual synchrony convention.
Yep.
Because light's arriving instantaneously, which is consistent with the physics of Einstein.
It absolutely is. That's what surprises people. But Einstein wrote about that. He knew about that. One of the things you can do is you can define the inward speed of light to be instantaneous, to be infinity, basically, as long as the outward speed is half c, where c is the round trip speed of light. And because the average has to be c.
Okay, Dr. Lisle, well, I'm just gonna define my height to be 6'8" on all of my dating profiles. And then I'm just gonna add the little caveat that actually I shrink back down to my normal height whenever anyone looks at me, or takes a picture of me, or in any way observes me. And then, it all just works out. All the math works out exactly the same way. It's in line with all of our observations. And, hey, I'm 6'8". Just don't look at me. You see how this is like the same thing as Lisle's anisotropic synchrony convention, right?
The bottom line is, if you use that convention, and I'm not saying that's the only convention, but I am saying it's the one the Bible probably uses. In that convention, it takes light no time at all to get from the distant stars to Earth using that time stamping procedure. And that's the one that all ancient cultures used.
What did he just say?
And that's the one that all ancient cultures used. It wasn't until relatively modern times that Einstein basically said, let's let the speed of light be this, out at sea and in at sea. And that means we're seeing not the present, but we're seeing the past. And how far out you look is how far back in time you're looking. I'm not saying that's wrong, by the way.
Really? Because it kind of sounds like that is exactly what you're saying. He kind of has to be saying that the idea that light travels the same way to and away from you is wrong, and that Einstein was incorrect. Otherwise, he would have to admit that the universe is 13.7 billion years old and the Bible is incorrect.
I'm not saying that's wrong, by the way. I'm just saying that it's also not wrong to say, no, we're seeing the universe in real time. The light travels here immediately using this visual synchrony convention that I believe the Bible uses. And there's good evidence that the Bible does use this ancient convention.
Really? Wow, there's good evidence of that, Dr. Lisle. Thank you. I have been waiting patiently on the edge of my seat this whole time for you to finally present some evidence to back up your claims about how every single ancient culture before Einstein used your synchrony convention. So let's hear it. What is this evidence in the Bible for your model?
In Genesis 1, when God makes the lights and the firmament, the sun, the moon, the stars also, he makes them to give light on the earth. That's one of their purposes, is to give light on the earth. And the Bible says, and it was so, which implies that they immediately began giving light on the earth. Immediately, as soon as they were created on day 4, they fulfilled their God-ordained purpose, or at least within 24 hours, to give light upon the earth. And so that suggests the visual synchrony convention. And therefore, there is no distant starlight problem if the Bible's using a visual synchrony convention.
Oh, I can't. That was it. What am I supposed to do with that, man? Bunch of old fairy tales? That's your evidence? I mean, come on. Yeah, okay. So, ancient people probably thought that they were seeing the stars in real time. Like, that's not very difficult to concede at all. Like, why would they think that they're looking at the sun 8 minutes in the past before they understood the physics there? But that's not all that your model entails, Dr. Lisle. Your model specifically is that light travels to us instantaneously and away from us at the speed of 1/c, and perpendicular to us at c, and in between there's all those gradations based on your trigonometric equation. That's your model. That's not in the Bible at all. That's not in any ancient cultures at all. They're not using your synchrony convention. They just don't understand relativity or physics yet because they're ancient people. I mean, Dr. Lisle is so wrong that he's not even wrong. I mean, he's literally just putting forward some unfalsifiable mathematical trick so that you get the same results in the end. So that little idea is the basis from which Lisle constructs his entire young Earth creation model from. And he's calling this the Doppler model because there's more things that he has to shoehorn in to try to explain the observations, right? Because we have something called the Hubble flow, where the more distant a galaxy is, the more redshifted it is. How would Lisle's model explain our observations of the relationship between distance and redshift? Well, you see, when galaxies move away from us, they are redshifted, and when they move towards us, they're blue shifted. So in Lisle's model, all of the farthest galaxies are moving away from us at the fastest rates. And again, there's no speed of light limit, so they can move at however fast they need to move in order to replicate our redshift results. Now, when you ask, well, why would all of the most distant galaxies be moving away from us at incredibly high speeds, and like the farther distant, the faster they're moving? What is causing that, Dr. Lisle? What sort of mechanism could possibly explain this? Let's listen to how Dr. Lisle responds to such an inquiry.
Maximiano Xavier, Dr. Lisle. If the redshift is due to a relativistic Doppler effect, what we've been talking about here, why would the speed of recession follow the Hubble law? Galaxies could have the same speed in different distances.
Yeah, so it goes back to the way that God started the universe. Apparently, God gave galaxies a higher velocity the farther away they are from us, probably as a design feature, as a stability feature. If God made all the galaxies stationary in a finite volume, eventually gravity would cause them to collapse in on themselves. Even if space isn't expanding or contracting, you could expect the masses would collapse in. So by giving them an outward velocity, it prevents that collapse. It makes the universe stable. So that's, I mean, I don't know. You're kind of asking, why did God do it that way? I don't know, but one possibility is for stability. And of course, galaxies do have, in addition to this Hubble flow, galaxies do have a little bit of velocity in and of themselves, which we call peculiar velocities. And so that's why you can have nearby galaxies can even be blue shifted, like M31, the Andromeda galaxy. But statistically, they tend to be moving away from us and from each other. It would have to be the case if they're radially moving away from us, they would be moving away from each other as well at a rate that is proportional to their distance, probably for the purposes of stability.
Wow. It was like he'd never even thought about that question before, which is such a low-hanging fruit question of just like, hey, why though? like his entire model is just so post facto ad hoc. He's just like literally, oh hey, wait, we observe a correlation between distance and redshift. Oh yeah, I mean, I guess the most distant galaxies must be moving away from us faster than the ones that are closest. And then you're like, why is that? And he's like, I don't know, God did it that way. Don't ask me. I mean, stability maybe, but like, we're talking about an all-powerful God here. When Einstein first came up with his equations, he just added in the cosmological constant to make it stable. Like, he just added in a little constant there to counteract gravity so that it wouldn't collapse in on itself. You're telling me that, like, Einstein was able to come up with a stability solution that God wasn't? Or, like, there is no reason why it has to be like this for stability, because you're dealing with an all-powerful God who can just make it stable without the Hubble flow. Like, there's literally no explanation for why there would be any relationship between redshift and distance under Lisle's model, unless he just changes his entire model to just make it just precariously just so to replicate our observations. Dr. Lisle's model is nothing more than mathematical tricks, fudging the process of getting the final results so that you can smuggle in your religious presuppositions in there without actually changing anything about the final outcomes, so that you can claim that it's somehow scientifically reputable. The anisotropic synchrony convention has essentially no explanatory power or predictive ability, or is anyway close to a scientifically rigorous hypothesis or theory. But in early 2022, before the James Webb Space Telescope was live and reporting its first results, Dr. Lisle wrote an article where he claims to use his Young Earth Creationist model to make predictions about what the James Webb Space Telescope should find for the very farthest galaxies. Now, I find this to be deliciously ironic, because the James Webb Space Telescope alone is sufficient to utterly and completely debunk and refute Jason Lisle's entire anisotropic synchrony convention model. Let me explain. So this idea for an experiment to debunk Lisle's model was actually proposed to me by a good friend of the channel, Mr. Anderson. He debates and debunks pseudoscience as well. Check out his channel. I'll link to it in the description, since this is sort of his idea, but I think it works brilliantly. So the James Webb Space Telescope stays and does its observations at the L2 Lagrange point, which is basically a point in space where all of the different gravitational fields from like the Earth and the Moon and the Sun and whatever all cancel out, so where it is very, very stable for the JWST to stay at this L2 Lagrange point in space. So we have an observer there at the L2 point, and we have our observers at Earth. Now, according to Dr. Lisle's model, if there was, say, a supernova, then the light from that supernova should reach both of the observers instantaneously. So JWST and telescopes on Earth should both observe the supernova at the exact same moment. Now, here's the thing. We know how long it would take for JWST to detect that signal, process that signal, and then transmit that it had seen that signal back to the stations on Earth. We know how long that process would take. And there is another instantaneous transmission, right? Because you have the JWST pointing it at the observers at Earth and then beaming that information there. So that should be instantaneous as well. So all said and done, from the moment when JWST first sees that supernova to when us on Earth we get the report back from JWST that it saw that supernova, it should only be like a couple microseconds, right? Just long enough for JWST to process it and then beam that signal our way. That should happen instantaneously under Lisle's model. But under the conventional consensus understanding of relativity in physics, that should not be the case. It shouldn't be that JWST receives the signal at the exact same time as observers on Earth. And it won't be able to instantaneously transmit that signal of reporting that supernova to us on Earth. So there should be a significant delay. So Dr. Lisle, you could use your PhD astrophysics credentials to propose this experiment and get some observation time on the JWST where you could actually test your model. I mean, think of that. You would get a Nobel Prize if you demonstrated this. And this is a clear experiment to see if your ask model is correct. But as the actual observations of supernovae using JWST have shown, that's not what happens. There is a delay. And so therefore, Lisle's entire notion of infinite speed light is just wrong and needs to be thrown out with the other biblical young earth narratives that also contradict scientific facts about reality. Now, finally, we can get to where Donnie showed him my slide with my points about the actual characterization of these most farthest galaxies. Let's hear what Lisle has to say.
This is a picture from a recent debate on the Big Bang Theory. And I'm curious as to your thoughts on those who are claiming that the data actually supports or was expected based on the naturalistic model. And there's several points here in terms of the farthest galaxies. And I'm curious if you're familiar with these points here and what would be a good response. Like we can start with one. One is supposedly have the highest redshift. And they're basically arguing that this is what the Big Bang model would expect, Dr. Lisle.
Well, yeah, any model in which the Hubble law applies, the farthest galaxies would have the highest redshifts. So that's an example of confirmation bias. That's a fallacy where you say my model predicts X, I see X, therefore my model's right, and you fail to account for the fact that every other model also predicts X. So any model in which the universe is expanding, not necessarily the fabric of space, but the galaxies are moving away from each other according to the Hubble law, the farthest galaxies would have the highest redshift. So yeah, they do, but that fits the Doppler model perfectly well.
Okay, so first of all, the reason why I made this slide for my opening was to show that the JWST's observations of the characteristics of the very farthest galaxies support the Big Bang model. I did not make the claim or imply the claim that each individual one of these points was some sort of differentiated line of evidence that supports the Big Bang as opposed to all other models. I mean, I guess in the Doppler model, Lisle's model, all the galaxies are, like the farthest galaxies are also the most redshifted just because they just so happen to be moving away from us at the fastest speed for no particular discernible reason at all. The fact remains that the most distant galaxies also being the most redshifted is a mandatory, necessary implication of the Big Bang model. It is a necessary prediction based on that model. Whereas Lisle's Doppler model actually has no explanation for why these galaxies would be moving the fastest when they're the farthest, where the Big Bang model necessarily mandates that. There's the difference. One model had explanatory predictive power, and the other model is just post hoc rationalizing our astronomical observations after the fact to try to force your biblical worldview into somehow still being true, even when it's in direct contradiction with observed reality.
Second point, they have very low metallicity. Yeah, but remember, the Big Bang predicted their metallicity ought to be 0.
Yeah, but actually, no, it fucking didn't at all, Dr. Lisle. You're confusing population 3 stars with our farthest observable galaxies, which are not the same thing at all, and you definitely know better as a PhD astrophysicist, so I don't know what I'm supposed to conclude from this other than you're just trying to intentionally manipulate words to try to mischaracterize the Big Bang model, what I'm saying, and what you're saying in your predictions, all just to make it seem like the Big Bang predictions were wrong and your predictions were right, even though, in actuality, what you're claiming are the Big Bang predictions are nothing but a straw man based on you manipulating the terminology, and your own predictions are incredibly baseless because you have absolutely no reason why you should expect the farthest galaxies to have the lowest metallicities, and metallicity here just refers to the proportion of heavy elements in those galaxies. The prediction of the current consensus cosmological model was that the farthest observable galaxies should have very low metallicities. It is a separate thing to say that the first ever stars, population 3 stars, should have 0 metallicity, which is a prediction, but those very first populations of stars are not the same thing as the very farthest, earliest observable galaxies, which are not necessarily made up of population 3 stars, because they are so short-lived that the earliest observable are most likely statistically made up of the longer-lived population 2 stars that have very low metallicities, which is just, for some reason, the Big Bang prediction is also Jason Lisle's prediction here in his article. It makes absolutely no sense why his Doppler model should predict low metallicities for these farthest galaxies at all. There's no reason for him to predict this other than the fact that he knows full well what JWST was going to find with those galaxies.
And there are some of these galaxies at incredible redshifts that have metallicity comparable to nearby galaxies. There was a study done, something like finding green peas in James Webb Space Telescope data, where it showed that they measured the metallicity of these distant galaxies and found that they have the same range of metallicity as nearby galaxies. That's not what the Big Bang predicted. That's what I would predict.
He is just straight up saying to the audience things that he knows are not true. In fact, they are literally the opposite of the truth. Let's go into his claims here about these green pea galaxies. Okay, so first of all, green pea galaxies are named that because when you look at them, they're really small, they're a little bead-like, and they're kind of greenish. So they look actually like green peas, okay? They're a very rare type of galaxy, and less than 1% of that very rare type of galaxy has low metallicity. And so Dr. Lisle here is trying to claim that because some exceedingly ultra rare types of low metallicity green pea galaxies are known, that therefore these observations of James WST are completely within the normal range of galaxies today. That is so disingenuous. So one of the lead authors of that Greenpeace study was Sangeeta Malhotra. Sorry for the pronunciation. But here you can see him speaking directly. He's a researcher at NASA who's saying right here, and we see that these galaxies in the JWST observations are young galaxies in every sense, full of young stars and glowing gas that contains few chemical products recycled from earlier stars. He says one of these galaxies contains just 2% of the amount of oxygen of a galaxy like our own, and might be the most chemically primitive galaxy yet discovered. That's right. The galaxy that Dr. Lisle is trying to characterize as being essentially within the same metallicity range as our normal galaxies today. That's how Dr. Lisle was characterizing it. It actually turns out to be the lowest metallicity galaxy that has ever been observed. Ever. Like, that is not just an accident or a mistake. Like, Dr. Lisle would have had to have knowingly lied to say what he just said about, again, let me just stress, the lowest metallicity galaxy ever found. And he's trying to characterize it as a normal range of metallicity.
3, they're time dilated. I don't know if that's been tested, but I would expect that because both the Doppler model and the Big Bang would predict that they're time dilated. The mechanism would be slightly different, but in the Doppler model, it's just a relativistic time dilation due to velocity. In the Big Bang model, it would be an apparent time dilation due to stretching of space. And so the subsequent peaks of light get delayed by the same factor. They predict exactly the same time dilation. I will point out that time dilation argues against the tired light model. So, but it's those first 3, second one's not really, well, it's not exactly true, but those first 3 are perfectly compatible with the Doppler model.
Again, the Doppler model that Dr. Lisle is talking about has absolutely no explanation for why the very farthest, most redshifted galaxies would be moving away from us at such ludicrous speeds. Like, absolutely no reason for that. He's saying that the Doppler model can accommodate the low metallicities that we definitely do observe. I don't know why Lisle is even trying to argue against this, because he says that his model predicts low metallicities for no reason, but he says that that's one of his predictions. So now he's trying to say that actually the galaxies that we're seeing are not low metallicity galaxies, which is absolutely insane. The amount of gaslighting of just don't believe your own eyes of what the actual spectroscopic data is showing you and the scientists that are analyzing that data are saying, where they're all agreeing that these are extremely low metallicity galaxies. But Dr. Lisle, for some reason, is trying to cast aspersions and doubt on that very easily verifiable observation, which he himself also predicted for no reason. It makes absolutely no sense. In his model, there is no reason why these galaxies should have such lower metallicity. That's a direct, necessary requirement of the Big Bang model. I guess that he can accommodate it in his model, but he has no reason to, other than it's just an ad hoc little tweak that he's got to add to his model to force it to fit with observations. I really just wish that somebody would ask Dr. Lisle, why do the very farthest, fastest moving galaxies in your model have such low metallicity? Why did God do it like that? Is he just going to say, well, that's just the way that God made it, I guess. Stability, I don't know.
Number 4, yeah, I mean, you tend to find stars and galaxies in general inside ionized bubbles. That can happen.
Wow. Well, he really does not want to dwell on this point, does he? That's just another one of those things that his model just has to accommodate. The fact that galaxies are readily observed in these ionized bubbles is something that makes no sense in the Doppler model. It's why would that be the case? What is the explanation? But in the Big Bang model, that's exactly what we would predict to see in the period called reionization, where the first populations of stars and galaxies are literally ionizing the gases around them, making these bubbles of reionized plasma around them in comparison with the non-ionized molecular clouds that would have pervaded the universe before the formation of the first stars and galaxies. That's why that observation is really good supporting evidence for the Big Bang model, and why Lisle had to skirt past it so quickly and just say, yeah, I mean, I guess that could happen under my model too. I mean, I don't really have an explanation for why the galaxies would be in these ionized bubbles, but whatever. I mean, who knows? Maybe God just did it that way for stability too.
5, extremely small, massive, and bright. That is contrary to the prediction of the Big Bang. The Big Bang predicted that these galaxies should be low mass. and that they should end at a redshift of 14. So that is not a prediction of the Big Bang. That was my prediction, is that they would be massive, and they're not small. The reason that secularists think that they're small physically, that they're 1,000 times denser than nearby galaxies, is because they're assuming the expansion of space, which creates this magnification effect, which we don't see. And so the assumption is, well, they actually are magnified. They're just really tiny. But that doesn't make sense, because we already know they're as massive as nearby galaxies and as bright as nearby galaxies. That's what I predicted. That's the opposite of what the Big Bang predicted.
Yeah, so I could take the time to go through the math of everything that Dr. Lisle just laid out and show you the faulty assumptions that he makes to get to the conclusion that he just said. But funnily enough, I don't even have to. Nor do I even have to go to an actual peer-reviewed scientific article to debunk this, because actually, the Answers Research Journal, Dr. Lisle's own creationist journal, debunked him on this just a couple of months after Dr. Lisle published this article laying out what he just went through about how the size of galaxies just debunks the Big Bang model, right? Well, Luke Barnes, another creationist physicist who's famous for arguing about how fine-tuning of the universe points to God, he published a response article in the Answers Research Journal debunking Lisle's previous article. It is the greatest thing ever. I will just read you the abstract. Lisle has alleged that the sizes of distant galaxies as observed by the James Webb Space Telescope are inconsistent with the predictions of the Standard Model of Cosmology. Here, we show that this inconsistency follows not from the model, but from simplistic and unrealistic assumptions in Lisle's modeling. Once the straw man is replaced by a more realistic set of assumptions, there is no inconsistency. You see, Dr. Lisle, I don't have to debunk you on this one, because your own peers of other fellow creationist physicists have already taken the liberty of doing so in your own creationist literature. It's just, mwah, chef's kiss. No notes.
6, oddly shaped. Actually, no, we're finding disk galaxies out there. The oddly shaped, clumpy, irregular galaxies was what the Big Bang predicted, but that's not what we found. We found fully formed, massive galaxies, many of which are spiral galaxies, even evidence of barred spiral galaxies.
Well, that just wasn't true at all. In fact, one might even say that that was just a bold-faced, patently false lie that Dr. Lisle just told. All of the earliest galaxies that JWST has observed, all of them, as in the highest redshifted galaxies, all of them have been irregularly shaped. None of them have been spiral, especially not barred spiral galaxies like Dr. Lisle just claimed. He is very, very dishonest here, where he's talking about, yes, we have observed spiral galaxies at greater redshifts than we thought, but those are not the farthest redshifted galaxies. Those are two different things. The farthest redshifted spiral galaxies that we've observed are like at a z value of 4, 3, or 2, which, by the way, the z value is like a measure of how redshifted something is. Meanwhile, the most redshifted galaxies that JWST has actually observed are like z values of 14, 13, and 12. Like, so much far beyond any of the redshifts of the actual spiral galaxies that we have. So, on my slide, when I report that the very farthest, most redshifted galaxies that JWST observes are highly irregularly shaped, and Dr. Lisle responds, well, actually, there are some spiral galaxies that are farther than we thought. That's a total non sequitur. That has nothing to do with the point that I just raised. And Dr. Lisle seems like he's intentionally lying to obfuscate that point, because he knows what I was saying, and he knows what I was saying is correct. Here you can see from the directly from the mouths of the scientists who see these galaxies themselves. They describe them as being highly irregular, uncommon shapes, talking about peanuts and pool noodles and fuzzballs. There are no highly mature, highly developed, barred spiral galaxies at these redshift values. Dr. Lisle is literally just lying to the audience here. There is no excuse for this. He knows better. He is saying something he knows is not true.
And then 7, very high star production. Well, again, that's an assumption. The fact is we find lots of stars in these galaxies because, and then the secularists would say, well, they must be producing stars at just tremendous rates. Well, that's because you've assumed that they've just sort of formed and at a much earlier time than you previously assumed. And so you have to assume that star formation is much more rapid. I don't need to invoke that rescuing device because I was expecting these galaxies to already have lots of stars because they're massive. We've never seen a star form. We've never seen a nebula in the process of collapsing into a star. That's never been observed. The nebulae where we have been able to measure their motion, they tend to be expanding, which is what we'd expect because normally the outward force of gas pressure is orders of magnitude greater in a nebula than the meager inward force of gravity.
Really, Dr. Lisle? So then, what is this that's been behind me this entire time? Which is a picture taken by the James Webb Space Telescope of a nebula collapsing into forming a star. Like you can see right here, here's the protoplanetary disk. Here's the gases of the nebula collapsing in to form a literal protostar in the process of becoming a star. It's literally pictured. It's been behind my head this entire video so far. What are you talking about, Dr. Lisle, that no one's ever seen this? It's in 4K HD right here.
I've never seen in any technical literature anybody showing me a nebula that is in the process of collapse where they've been able to measure the motion in it and it is collapsing into a star. That's never been seen.
Really? So then what is this then, Dr. Lisle? This is exactly what you just said doesn't exist, and it wasn't very hard to find. There were dozens and dozens of papers observing gas fall into a protostar, which is not yet a star. It hasn't begun nuclear fusion yet. It's a young stellar object. And we have directly observed all of these gases and dust falling into it and it growing as a result. Something that you just said no paper had ever shown. There were dozens of them that I could choose to include. I just wanted to include this one because it's one of the newest ones, and they didn't even need infrared. They could do it visually with just the visual light spectrum. Come on, Dr. Lisle. You don't need to lie about this.
And it would make headline news if they found something like that, because it's something that the secular astronomers expect to find, though we don't find it.
Do you mean like maybe this article headline from back in 2013, where the researchers literally say that they observed matter being dragged into the center of a huge gaseous cloud by the gravitational pull of a forming star, a protostar that is not yet an actual star. It's in the process of becoming one.
So some of those are not predictions of the Big Bang, and the ones that are things I would predict too.
Wow. You're an encyclopedia worth of information, Dr. Lisle. Sorry, critics. But you just handled all of those. Wow, that's awesome. Sam, any thoughts, brother?
No, I'm not on that. Yeah.
To the surprise of absolutely no one, Sam from Redefined Living has 0 thoughts. But in all seriousness, I actually do agree with at least one thing that Dr. Lisle said there at the end. Many of these things that he brought up were not predictions of the Big Bang model. In fact, they were just his own straw-manned version of the Big Bang model, like his claim that we would expect to find all these population 3 stars, despite the fact that scientists understand how remarkably rare those would be, and we're not really that optimistic about finding them. Instead, Lisle's conclusion here is emblematic of his entire career. Jason Lisle doesn't do science anymore. He hasn't done science since he earned his PhD. What Jason Lisle does is he sells his authoritative credentials to his creationist audience by going out on these circuits of lectures and podcasts and YouTube videos where he then says a bunch of stuff that sounds really scientific, and he has a PhD and he knows some physics, so it convinces the audience that, hey, all of these scientists telling us that the science says that the Earth can't be 6,000 years old, well, here's a creationist astrophysicist who says otherwise. It makes them feel like maybe they have science on their side, and it's just, oh, something about those non-Christian scientists just letting their own biases slip in, while we have Dr. Lisle, who's doing the good work, who's bringing back the Christian worldview into cosmology. That's what they think. And you saw that effect summed up remarkably by Donnie there at the end. He heard Jason go through all of my various points and either just completely lie about them or debunk a straw man that wasn't representative of anything I was actually saying. And at the end of that, Donnie, reassured, cognitive dissonance vanquished, says, "Wow, Dr. Lisle, that was amazing. Your encyclopedic knowledge. The critics will have no response to this at all." You see, when young Earth creationists like Donnie are confronted with observational data that conflicts with their worldview, that is outside of their ability to understand, it's too high level, that's where someone like Jason Lisle comes in, who can come in, assuage all their concerns, explain away the data with things that sound like they could be scientific if you don't know any better. And of course, if you don't know any better, you're not going to be able to catch when he's just lying to you. Then it makes everybody feel better at the end of it and saying, oh wow, these critics, they must have been wrong. Jason Lisle, he can refute all of their points easily. Okay, well, Dr. Lisle, if you think that you can actually debunk my points so easily, why don't you debunk this video? Or even better yet, why don't you just agree to have a conversation with me? Now, I have been told that Dr. Lisle will only converse with other PhDs. Well, Dr. Lisle, it's pretty apparent for the rest of us what you're doing. You want to try to use your PhD credentials as a cloak of authority when you're dealing with your other young Earth creationist crowds. And then you want to try to use your PhD to prevent yourself from being criticized by others publicly, because you won't publish any of your papers in actual scientific journals where relevant expert PhDs in the field would have a chance to go over your work and peer review you. You won't do that. You only post on creationist blogs, websites, and YouTube channels. It is the last refuge of cowardice. But if Dr. Lisle wants to prove me wrong on this, I would be more than happy if he could just engage substantively with my points, even if he doesn't actually want to engage with me personally. Well, the points are all on the table now, Dr. Lisle, so the ball is in your court. If you liked this debunking video and you want to see more, I debunk tons of creationist, flat earther, pseudoscientist nonsense on this channel, from physics, astronomy, biology, geology, basically every branch of science, history, and philosophy. So check out the rest of the channel because there's a ton more videos about this and other related content on there. And guys, if you are not subscribed, it makes the world of difference to me and the algorithm if you do so. It doesn't really cost you that much, but it makes me get all the happy chemicals in my brain when I see it. So please subscribe and hit that bell to get notifications for future videos, and stay tuned for more.